Welcome to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, fifth lecture in the 2024 to 2025 Democracy and Ethno-Nationalism Lecture Series. Today, we are privileged to host Dr. James Jones for a lecture about his groundbreaking book, The Last Plantation, Racism and Resistance in the Halls of Congress. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights is the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school committed to research, advocacy, and public education on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the United States as well as abroad. We are proud to be housed at the Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. And the People's Electric Law School has a proud history of defending the rights and the lives of the underprivileged, the oppressed, and the censored in American society. Today, March 25th, 2025, our nation is experiencing an unprecedented crackdown on free speech, academic freedom, and anti-racism programs at universities. If you oppose such authoritarian campaigns that threaten fundamental American democratic values, I encourage you to support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by making a donation, ideally a generous one, by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. You can also learn more about the important work of CSRR by following us on social media at Rutgers CSRR, on Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and at RUCSRR on Twitter and Facebook. And I encourage you to watch our past lectures. We have over 110 lectures on our YouTube channel by subscribing to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights channel. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce our guest today, Dr. James R. Jones, who is an associate professor of Africana Studies and Sociology and the inaugural director of the Center for Politics and Race in America at Rutgers University, Newark. And so I am privileged and honored to have him as a colleague at Rutgers Newark. Dr. Jones received his PhD in sociology from Columbia University, and his research studies the political production of racism. He investigates political institutions as racialized workplaces and examines the social processes that shape and sustain them. In this work, he foregrounds the careers, work experiences, and activism of Black government workers. Dr. James is a leading expert on congressional staff diversity. He has authored 3 policy reports that show the systemic underrepresentation of people of color on Capitol Hill, including as senior staffers in the Senate and paid interns. His writing has appeared in academic journals like the Du Bois Review and Sociological Forum, as well as public outlets including Teen Vogue, The Daily Beast, and The Hill. Dr. Jones's research has also been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Dirksen Congressional Center, Duke University, and Princeton University. Today, Dr. Jones will be presenting his book, The Last Plantation, Racism and Resistance in the Halls of Congress, published with Princeton University Press in 2024. The title draws on the fact that members of Congress and their staff have applied this telling nickname to the legislature in order to highlight how the institution is exempt from the very policies and principles it's tasked to create and implement, namely federal workplace laws. In The Last Plantation, Dr. Jones draws upon the plantation metaphor to analyze how race and racism are produced and maintained within the congressional workplace, and in return, how Black staffers resist unequal and racist work conditions. So I can't think of a more timely moment in American history to be discussing this important book. And so with that, I have the privilege of giving the virtual floor to our guest, Professor Dr. James Jones. The virtual floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Zahar. I am very excited to be here to talk to you all about my new book, The Last Plantation. Now, I have to be honest, I have been giving book talks for the last year, and I can't start the talk the way that I normally would. I have to acknowledge the political moment that we are in. So just briefly, I want to give you an overview of what I want to talk about. I want to first talk about what the meaning of the last plantation and how this metaphor is a really insightful and innovative way to look at Congress as a racialized workplace. I want to talk to you a little bit about my findings, which is in short, it matters who is in the room, why we need Black staffers and other people of color, women of all backgrounds in policymaking rooms, and how they make a difference and make sure that our laws are as representative, as equitable, and as fair as they can be. And then I want to talk a little bit briefly about the political moment, right? And the moment that we find ourselves in and how this is related to Congress as the last plantation. Now, I want to talk to you today, but about what I consider to be one of our significant challenges confronting our multiracial democracy. Now, in this moment, there are so many, right? And again, if I were to say this presentation a year ago, I would keep going and not, acknowledge what is happening right now. But there are so many challenges, and it seems as though it's coming from every side or on many different sides. But I think one thing that remains unnoticed is about the people who are in the room when policies are getting made. And it's not necessarily our elected officials or unelected billionaires, but it is the staffers, right? It is the people who do the work. I want to focus on that issue today in Congress. Um, I want to talk about how racism shapes the day-to-day activities of our nation's foremost lawmaking institution and the profound impact that it has on legislation that shapes our society. It also pertains to how racism determines who can participate in American politics, underscoring how white supremacy operates as a political system. Now, this all begins with Congress being dubbed the name the last plantation. Now, this is a name that you will not find in any news coverage about Congress today, nor are you likely to encounter this dubious nickname in research about Congress. But for decades, Congress was known as the last plantation. It was a name used widely by lawmakers, staffers, and their journalists. Now, the roots of this nickname are deep and knotted, but they're also quite simple to understand. That the people who were employed by Congress, from a senator's aide to the janitors and cafeteria cooks, were not covered by congressional workplace laws. 60 years ago, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It outlawed discrimination in employment based upon race, color, and religion, sex, and national origin. Now, some have argued that this is the most important law that Congress has ever passed. Prior to then, 95% of American workplaces were segregated by race and sex. This law made workplaces more diverse, fair, and equal. It also allowed Black Americans and white women who were previously excluded from or assigned to the most junior roles to enter new professions and to ascend into senior roles. However, again, this most important law that Congress ever has passed didn't apply to Congress and the legislative branch. Beginning in 1970s, the media reported on the congressional exemption and the widespread presence of racial and gender discrimination in the congressional workplace. For example, in 1974, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported how Hill offices discriminated in staff recruitment. A few Democratic representatives wrote that no minority should apply in ads for administrative aides. And and the Congressional Employment Office were instructed to indicate the race of Black job seekers and mark their resumes with the letter B. These job announcements were not just racist, they were also sexist as well. One Democrat sought a woman to fulfill a temporary typist position and demanded white, no pantsuits. While a Republican advertised for a woman Republican staffer, but added, doesn't have to be a looker, but stated they should be attractive, smart, young, and no Catholics or no water signs. So I'm sorry if you're an Aquarius, you can't work on Capitol Hill in this office. Now, these prejudices from Democrats and Republicans are very telling. They reveal the beliefs and biases about who should work and hold certain positions in a hierarchical congressional workplace, where still to this day, most senior roles are overwhelmingly held by whites and men. They dubbed Congress the last plantation because as the 1964 Civil Rights Act began to root out racism and sexism in American workplaces and various types of organizations, Congress was, in fact, an artifact of the past. It was the last plantation um, to stay still. And of course, there are still plantations there, but the metaphor was pretty telling for understanding this exemption, this double standard. Um, this this exemption made Capitol Hill a place where anything goes, as Senator John Glenn said when he was the first lawmaker to go on record calling the last plantation. Now, lawmakers argued that they had to exempt themselves from federal workplace laws to preserve the separation of powers between two co-equal branches of the federal government. They they worried that the executive branch, which enforces federal workplace laws, would not only oversee the congressional workplace, but more dangerously would begin to regulate congressional power. The answer to this imagined constitutional conundrum was for Congress to exempt itself from federal workplace laws. And again, in a new racial epic marked by a commitment to equal opportunity and anti-discrimination, Congress was an outlier. It was the only institution to survive our racist past unchanged. Capitol Hill became one of the last places where you could still discriminate and exploit workers with impunity. It was the last plantation. Now, for over 30 years, lawmakers struggled to apply federal workplace laws to Congress. And this was finally achieved in 1995. Members of Congress cheered that they were abolishing the last plantation and the liberating plantation workers. And just like that, the last plantation metaphor disappeared. But in designating Congress as the last plantation, congressmen, staff, and even reporters were perhaps unknowingly and unwittingly identifying what I argue is a central dynamic in preserving America's racial hierarchy. Now, although we don't use this plantation metaphor today, it's still helpful for understanding how Congress operates. Now, the existence of the congressional plantation metaphor is in some ways glaring. Members of Congress are overwhelmingly white. Even still today, 75% of members of Congress are white, and this is in the most diverse Congress there has ever been. Their age are equally homogeneous, particularly when you're looking at top staffers, right? 86% of top staffers in the House are white, and 89% of top staffers in the Senate are white, right? These are the people like chiefs of staff, legislative directors, communications directors, people who are running these offices and providing critical advice to lawmakers right before they cast important legislation that shapes our own lives. And even at the bottom, it is equally as white. Paid interns are overwhelmingly white. I did a study with Rutgers Newark students where we identified 78% of paid interns out of a new program that was supposed to make Congress much more inclusive, went to overwhelmingly to white students and students who were relatively well off, right? For instance, we found that 78% of paid interns were white, and these are mostly college students. However, whites only account for about 52% of the national undergraduate population. So again, we sort of see this glaring, disparity, right? The structure in the thing about Congress is that while the hierarchy is in many ways quite visible or invisible to when we look at staffers, the way in which race shapes the entirety of the congressional workplace and Congress as an institution has become much more invisible and harder to understand. So my book looks at how racism shapes the legislative work, how racism shapes legislative work and the organization of the congressional workplace. I do this by studying the work of Black staffers. And today I want to focus on the work that Black staffers do and how their work, how they think of their work differently than their white counterparts. For this project, it's mainly based upon interviews with nearly 80 congressional staffers who ranged from chiefs of staff to interns. I asked them questions about how they got their start on the Hill, what they did from day to day, and their contributions to the legislative process. Now, Congress is a very insular and non-transparent workplace. I gained access through relationships I cultivated as a former intern, and specifically with Black staffers. These relationships allowed me to observe staff association meetings to gain an intimate understanding of the lived realities of Black congressional staffers. As a sociologist of race and work and organizations, I see Congress as an incredibly complex social institution that leads me to not only focus on what congressional staffers do, but to examine how they do their jobs. Now, these interviews with Black staffers underscore how, from the day-to-day business of American lawmaking, politics is relational and social relationships are foundational. Studying Black workers, I argue, is incredibly important because they are the longest and loudest critics of racism on Capitol Hill, and people who have been infected by racism most personally. So I look at the plantation metaphor as a way of trying to understand how Congress operates as a racialized governing institution, um, organized by racism. And I look at how Black workers fight back against this racism, how they use their power on Capitol Hill, their agency, to make it a site of minority empowerment, particularly um, in the legislative process. So I want to talk about briefly what I found, which is the work of congressional staffers. Now, congressional staffers are the people behind the scenes making things happen. People, regardless of their race, people who I interviewed talked about how it was staffers who were writing legislation, who were writing speaking points and speeches, who were organizing hearings. And they pointed out how critical, um, you know, the or how much influence these staffers had. And it was critical that diversity was in the room because it influenced the outcomes in the legislative process. So briefly, what I found is that what lawmaker or Black staffers engage what I call inclusive lawmaking or inclusive policymaking. They challenged racist legislation. They represented marginalized interest, and they also promoted inclusive hiring practices. This work engaging in inclusive policymaking ranged depending on the seniority, the expertise, and the relationship that staffers have with their lawmakers. So some staffers were in a position to more forcefully argue for to stop racist legislation, right? Because maybe because they had a law degree and they understood this, or because they had a deep multi-year relationship with their lawmaker that they could go to them, and their opinions would be and perspectives would be respected and welcomed. Um, and I think the other thing that I found is that this work existed not only in continuum, but it manifested most acutely in areas which were uncrystallized and malleable. Now, what this means is that oftentimes racial diversity matters when you think racial diversity doesn't matter. So Black staffers were, you might think that we might need Black staffers on policy issues like criminal justice reform or, well, let's just use criminal justice reform, right? It's an issue that disproportionately affects Black Americans. But in those areas, these lawmakers are receiving strong cues from external stakeholders about how they should vote. Where Black staffers really came into focus were on those matters where it wasn't so clear cut that this was a racial issue, or there weren't strong cues from lawmakers about, what they should be doing. So it was the Black staffer in the office raising their hands like, I think we should think about it this way, right? This is how it might impact the Black community. Right. So I want to go through a few different examples about how this worked. First, I want to sort of talk about the influence and the power of congressional staff, right? And again, this is a really hierarchical place, but it's also a really small workplace, right? So we have senior staffers like chiefs of staff, legislative directors, and communications directors. These are people who are going to really run in congressional offices, right? They're going to manage staff. They're going to establish office protocols, and they provide political and policy guidance. These are the top staffers that I was talking about a few slides ago. We have mid-level staffers like legislative assistants and policy advisors. These are the people who are going to be the eyes and ears of lawmakers, particularly when we're thinking about legislative issues. They're going to be the people who are researching and writing and legislation and providing vote recommendations. And then we have junior staffers like staff assistants, schedulers, and interns. It might be tempting to think about these folks as people who don't have power, but everyone has power on Capitol Hill just by virtue of being there, but also because these offices are relatively small, right? In the House, you might have 5 to 10 people working in an office. In the Senate, it might be 20 to 40, depending on the size of the state. And in a matter of a few years, you can go from being a paid intern to a staff assistant to a legislative assistant to a legislative director, right? So there are these short career ladders. And again, it matters who holds these opportunities. Overwhelmingly, they're held by whites, right? And these staffers have a lot of power. Now, if we're thinking back about the last Senate or the last some of the last Congresses, we can sort of look at think about who is in the room. So one of the chief accomplishments of the Biden administration was the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Which was an unprecedented amount of federal funding towards, let's say transportation and infrastructure issues, climate change. Chuck Schumer, who mentions on Twitter how one of his staffers had a baby 2 days ago, but had to return to work to keep working on the bill. The thing that, in this Washington Post article that talks about the senior staffers who were responsible for negotiating this Inflation Reduction Act, they don't mention that they were all white. So what are the consequences when it's all whites who are developing how money will be spent on infrastructure, transportation, and climate change, issues that also have racial consequences? So Michelle was one of the staffers I interviewed. She was a senior staffer to a Democratic senator and worked on his community Senate committee. And she talked about why racial and gender representation matter. So she is someone who I would describe as one of those really elite Black professionals or political professionals of the 21st century. She had worked in the House, the Senate, the White House, and in the nonprofit space, and really had made a name. But she got her start on the Hill. And she talked to me about why it was important to have racial representation. So she talked to me about the passage of the Defense of Marriage Act, which was being debated in the late 1990s. And there was a lot of consternation about it. There was a lot of debate about what types of amendments the Democrats would offer, knowing well that DOMA was going to pass with overwhelming numbers. Still, there was a debate amongst Senate staffers about which, if any, amendments their senator would offer that might mitigate the blow of this notorious anti-gay legislation, which was going to pass. So, So part of that, she told me, that debate centered on the hate crimes bill that we drafted and the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which was a bill, again, that targeted employment discrimination against gays and lesbians. And there were many long debates about congressional staffers, about the two amendments, um, offering these two bills as amendments to DOMA. And so essentially what she's saying here is, you know, this piece of legislation, everyone recognizes it is bad. It's going to pass. What should be the Democratic response, right? And again, I think this moment is very analogous to what is happening. Um, there was fear that there was one camp to say, let's put up these amendments that would reaffirm our commitments to LGBT civil rights. But it wasn't clear if these amendments would pass. And so there was a question of like, would it damage the entire movement by showing this failed vote? Right. And so it's a question about strategy, and it's a question about doing, frankly, what's right. And so here's her response as she told me she was sitting in that meeting debating strategy and debating what would be the course of action for her senator. And she said, I remember sitting in those conversations and having people make the argument about whether or not it was time. And at one point, it really just did hit me that just about 40 years and less before that, people had been having those debates around the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65. And those debates were about me as a woman, about me as an African American. And at some point, you have to determine that you are going to push forward. And I had a strong sense of where my boss would be. And I just remember deciding, I'm not going to sit here and debate this issue anymore. I'm going to go back to my office and get ready for the debate on the floor. And we should talk to the center about why we have to move forward. And I did, and we did. Right. So again, I think this is a really powerful moment where Michelle, who is this Black woman, talks about, how she sees her identity influencing how she thinks about political strategy. But also, she had the power to end the conversation, said, we're not going to debate this anymore. We're going to move forward what I think is right? And again, her identity, her racial and gender identity influenced her decision making. Now, Keisha was another a Black woman, and it's interesting. I'm focusing on Black women today, and they're all lawyers, which is an interesting thing we can sort of get into later about just the credentials that Black women and Black folks more broadly need to have, oftentimes, to work on Capitol Hill. They are in many ways over credentialed than some of their white counterparts. Now, again, I want to emphasize how um, the ability to engage in inclusive policymaking depends on your expertise and your relationship with the lawmaker and also your position, right? Um, and so a lot of times, again, this is what's happening on Capitol Hill, right? So I spoke to Keisha, who was a Black woman who was working for a white Republican senator, and she told me I really supported the agenda of my senator when I could. However, I don't think people understand how much power congressional staffers. We inform the senators and congressmen of what is going on. They barely have time to think. Right. And then that's just like, I want to pause here just to emphasize how busy these lawmakers are, right? Their days are scheduled in 15 to 30-minute increments from sunrise to sunset. Their meetings, which are constantly changing, are different every meeting. Increasingly large part of their job is spent doing media interviews and also fundraising. And so the job of lawmaking itself often gets delegated to their staffers, right? So again, these staffers have a lot of influence, right? And they can push back in certain ways, right? Again, if they have the expertise, if they have the position, and if they have the relationship with the lawmaker. And so Keisha is someone who started off with her Republican senator as an intern and had cultivated a really multi-year or years-long relationship with him where she had gained the trust of her senator, so much so that she was able to negotiate to be a legislative assistant, one in which was a position that allowed her to do a little bit more strategy work that could, see her influencing the policymaking agenda. And she told me, quite frankly, to me, I'm able to craft the senator's point of view. She emphasized that although she had her own views about how recommendations were based, she emphasized although she had her own views, her recommendations were based upon legal precedent and what made sense for her boss, giving his past voting record. She told me there have been plenty of times I stated, this is what I think I'm basing, this is what I think, this is what I'm basing it on. But and he could just say no. But she told me, I, as an African American female, have been any issue of any piece of legislation that has discriminatory practices in it, on it, around it, and on its face. Now, she told me this example of how an immigration lobbying group petitioned her office to support upcoming legislation that would allow a special visa for Irish immigrants. Now, Keisha explained to me that she was personally opposed to this legislation because it would give preferential treatment. So she told me I had to sit there and tell the senator, you can vote for this if you want, but you're putting Irish people in front of Black people, in front of Indian people that has to wait 17 years. You're saying that essentially that Irish people can come here um, and be offered a visa with educational credentials similar to a high school degree, but while many other racial and ethnic groups would have to have advanced degrees to obtain a visa. So she was passionately arguing against this racist double standard, which didn't even, frankly, come up or was known to her um, other, peers, right? They were just ready to sort of co-sign onto this legislation, that they were being lobbied for. And she told them quite frankly, you're racist and if you sign it. She further emphasized how this legislation would create a preferential treatment for a select group. She says, if they have an Eritrean visa, you better give it to them. If you don't want to be the Republican that's giving out visa based upon race, you better say no. Now, while other staffers who were white pointed out that this was an important constituency in their state and many other funders were Irish, Keisha held her ground and her position, which was both informed by her legal training, but also her racial identity. I want to turn to sort of think about how race and gender impacts congressional hearings. Now, congressional hearings are incredibly important because it's one of the rare opportunities that we can see Congress at work, right? We get to see them advocating, investigating, the executive branch officials, corporate interest, and it's incredibly important. So this is a, notable moment from the first Trump administration. So here we have Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashina Tlaib, the squad, and that gray head right in front of them is Michael Cohen, right? And so he's testifying how his boss, Donald Trump, is a racist, a sexist, a xenophobe, and a con man. But when this moment appeared in 2018, I'm not mistaken, it went viral. It was this sort of, frankly, badass moment where you had three women of color holding the executive branch accountable for their misdoings. Um, and so it was an image that was circulating quite widely on social media. And so Ayanna Pressley, and who was a former congressional staffer herself, replied to a tweet about this. She says, I love this mashup, but I'm reframing it so you can get a glimpse of the women behind this woman. I'm grateful to my dedicated A team and the committee staff for this diligent preparation that went into yesterday's hearing. So we see her zoom out of that close-up frame of her with AOC and Rashida Tlaib to sort of look at the staff behind her, right? And again, these are the people who are preparing them for these hearings. Their work is often rendered invisible, but it's their labor who makes their job easy, right? And again, we see that racial and gender representation is critically important for these people who are working on committees. Now, Karen was a senior staffer for a Black Democratic representative, and she talked to me about her work about, engaging, representing her boss and racial and gender equity. She says, um, with respect to hearings, that was what's wonderful about being a chair. She was being able to craft and have hearings on issues that you think are important. It was an opportunity to move somebody's agenda along. And her boss gets so busy, more than not, it was we who brought the ideas to him. So again, we're at this point where we sort of recognize that lawmakers are incredibly busy folks, right? And they are emphasizing how staffers are the people who um, um, doing the work. And so Karen decided to have a hearing on credit scores and how they were calculated, paying attention to how this might affect communities of color with this, this algorithm, right? And again, we can think about this hearing and it's so analogous to the moment that we are in and thinking about how our lives are shaped by these algorithms and how they reproduce racial inequality. Um, but so Karen wanted to investigate it. And she told me about all the work that her and her staff did to make this happen for her representative, who was a Black Democrat, and someone who was, I would say, well respected, and someone people had a good reputation of being smart. He knew what he was talking about. Um, and she says, we brought in all the folks of the crediting agency, as well as some private sector people. For the majority of witnesses, we would write the hearing memo and focus the hearing in a particular direction. So we often had an idea from the very beginning about what we wanted to get out of the hearing, to the point of not only preparing questions for the chairman to elicit certain responses, but we also put together questions and share them with the staff of the Democratic Committee. And sometimes they love that because that's less work for them. And again, I want to emphasize how stressful the congressional workplace is, right? It is a space where everyone's kind of overwhelmed and overworked and underpaid, right? And again, this is important. So she told me one thing else about this hearing. And she says, uh, one thing we did for her boss was to go to different agencies and to pull his credit for him so he could see and get an idea and see how the scores would differ from agencies, credit reporting agencies, are not even close together. And it was a learning experience for him, Karen told me. Now, and one of the things that he said is that at the opening of this hearing is that I have learned a lot, right? And Karen was being very modest and showed considerable deference to her boss, but in actuality, she had a really consequential role in this hearing. She was the woman behind the curtain, orchestrating the hearing from start to finish. This includes educating her boss on the important consumer issues, which he was in charge of for the country, right? So again, it matters. Why, who's in the room, who is advising staff. And again, as Karen's career experiences points out, Black staff representation is also important in the offices of Black lawmakers. Now, while the congressional members of the Congressional Black Caucus, who are constantly referred to as the conscience of the Congress, have a clear anti-racist agenda, it's staffers like Karen who are crucial in helping to define and these broad interests and implement them. Um, One last quote, and this is from Deidre, another Black attorney who worked for a white Democratic representative. And she talked about how, her job was really just focusing on healthcare, right? She was working on the Affordable Care Act. But one of the other things that she would do that was not technically part of her job was to advocate for Black and Latino constituents in her district. And she kind of said the quiet part out loud that, he has a high Hispanic population and he has a high um, Black population, but they all kind of don't get his attention. So she told me, my goal has been, it still is to shape his priorities to reflect all of his constituencies, especially those that I wouldn't say he's not aware of, but they wouldn't have as much as voice as some of the other constituencies in our district, right? And so we know that members of Congress, their attention have been captured by corporate interest, right? So it is people like Deidre who are making sure that Black staffers had, or Black constituents had a voice in their office. So her technique was a little bit different, right? Whereas her strategy was to try and orchestrate or influence her boss's travel schedule. So whenever he had time in the district, that he had opportunities to meet with these Black and brown folks so they could tell him directly what they were thinking. And this was a struggle that she had internally with her staff, who was the rest of the staff who was majority white, to get this to happen. Overall, what I found is that it is critically important who works on Capitol Hill, especially when we're thinking about racial representation. Again, congressional staffers do the work. They construct, implement, and realize the political agendas of elected officials, right? By having a racially diverse congressional workforce, it helps to increase the quality of legislative deliberation and helps to ensure that multiple perspectives are included in the decision making that will ever affect everyone. This also helps to make sure that policymaking is much more equitable and just. And we can have a little bit more faith that when we know that multiple perspectives have been included, right? It's not necessarily like that this will uh, it's not necessarily a guaranteed outcome, but it is the process that matters, right? And of course, this matters because Congress is the sort of credentialing institution, and people who work as congressional staffers have these long careers where they enter the rest of the American political system at really elite and influential levels, whether it's the Supreme Court or the White House, lobbying or working on campaigns. Now, just briefly, I want to think, sort of pull from like, the few lessons from the book, right? And it is to say that white supremacy is a political system. This is work that I'm sort of building off of Charles Mills and his thinking about the racial contract. But oftentimes we think about racism as both the law, but also as a sort of racist boogeyman, right? And we can think about the various boogeymen that exist in our political climate today. But it is also organizational, right? It is reproduced and produced through structures, right? So when we're thinking about how racism is produced on Congress, it is not only through the laws, but is by its organizational capacity, one in which race is class and gender is shaping how people get jobs, how policies are deliberated and implemented. And again, there are many different drivers, right? This is based upon when we're thinking about the congressional workplace, how the exemption from federal workplace laws, the independent management of congressional offices, which allow different sets of rules to take place in one office versus another, the lack of transparency, the fact that we do not know the exact number or demographics of the congressional workplace, which also in turn shapes our ability to hold lawmakers accountable um, uh, to having um, offices that uh, look like our country. And this has effect, right? So when we're looking at the racialized, you know, inequality in the congressional workplace, it has this sort of large effect, right? So race, class, and gender affects who gets jobs. Most jobs are based upon social networks. These networks are majority white. This influences how work gets done, and it influences both our laws and who becomes our lawmakers. And I think there in this moment, there is this really present thinking about the winnowing and whitening of the federal government, which is in many ways what's been happening in Congress. So there is this sort of anomaly, similarity there. but I will stop and I will turn it over to Sahar.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones. That was enlightening and not even, I think, iceberg or a tip of the iceberg of your rich book that is rich with qualitative and empirical data. So I hope that people in the audience will buy the book and read it. Let me start with a few of my questions. In the meantime, encourage people in the audience to use the Q&A function to ask any questions they may have. Admittedly, you've made a lot of provocative claims, right? Claims that the current Trump administration would fire people over and deport people over. I mean, it's gotten to the point where even saying systemic racism or systemic anti-Black racism is now allegedly not totally illegal, but treated as if it's illegal, and certainly a basis for alleging that that is anti-white racism. So I had a couple questions with regard to the underrepresentation. You know, when you're trying to explain certain outcomes that are clearly disparate or unequal, causation is always a challenge. Causation, correlation, relevancy. And when you were researching your book, were you able to assess? I mean, I see kind of at least 4 different categories of potential causal factors, right? One is access to information that these opportunities exist. For example, with college students, to even know there are these internships. Here's how you apply. Here's the deadlines. Here's why you should apply. Here's how it benefits you. The second is the application rate itself. And you know, we hear this often as a pretext for why there aren't women in certain high-level fields where they're just not interested in applying. But of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. But do you have a sense of the application rate along different racial demographics or ethnic demographics? And then the third is whether or not they're actually hired. Right? So they may have the information, they may apply, but they're not getting hired. And then finally, whether they're getting promoted. So they may, for example, you may find that the rate is increasing at the intern level, but then they're hitting a glass ceiling or a brick wall. So how much of that were you able to analyze when looking for those various causal factors that contribute to the lack of the clear lack of representation based on the numbers?
So thank you. This is a really great question. And I want to go to your first point, which I think was a comment, but just to think about the high, it's the political moment that we're in, right? So, you know, my book is called The Last Plantation, right? Very provocative. I want to be clear, you know, this is like, I this is a name that I haven't given to Congress, right? But that was given to Congress by members of Congress themselves, right? So this is a bipartisan name, right? One in which, you know, Republican senators like John McCain have used this last plantation metaphor. He said it on record in the 1980s. Chuck Grassley, again, who I showed in the slides, has used this metaphor. And he is, you know, Republican from Iowa, still in Congress. And so I think it really is interesting, like, you know, the moment we're in, which we can find things which political, but for decades were not. But they were sort of this, you know, common sense agreement that, you know, this is a problem. You know, we can quibble about how they understood it, but like just thinking about language and how it is used to sort of describe racial inequality, right? So I think, you know, to your questions, I think this was the struggle of the book, right? How do you write about racial inequality? And as a social scientist, this was a struggle, in part because of the limitations that I had, right? And so it meant that I wrote the book in a certain way. I mean, of course, on qualitative data, but looking at the structure, right? I think, you know, in other workplaces, there are many other studies where you can sort of get these clear studies of causation or correlation. We can sort of look at who has been hired or who has applied, who's been hired, and look at promotion rates. The thing that makes this difficult in Congress, which also goes back to its idea of it being the last plantation, is that it is exempt from so many of the different reporting requirements, anti-discrimination requirements that Congress has imposed on other workforces, right? To root out discrimination. So again, one of the things that the Civil Rights Act does is, and with the formulation of the Equal Opportunity Commission, is it mandates that large employers over 50 or 100 collect demographic data, right? So they are collecting data on who's applying to jobs, right? Whenever you're applying for a job, or if we're applying for Rutgers, we check that box. And of course, there are struggles with that box and how we think about racial and ethnic categories. But there is data on this, and then this data gets sent to the EEOC. Researchers like me and you can request this data, and we can sort of measure, right? We can evaluate. It's like, what's happening here? That doesn't exist on Congress, right? And so a lot of the reason, or a key way that inequality is, allowed to sort of fester is through this lack of accountability, is a lack of reporting, right? It's a black box, right? Also, like oftentimes congressional offices don't even keep records, right? So part of the, like, I think that's really pressing about the multiple uses of the last plantation is that it really is a blast from the past. It is an outdated institution, right? So applying for a job on the Capitol Hill could mean that you are applying to a Gmail address, right? And any type of professional or elite workplace, you would think that there would be better systems in place to make sure that everyone's actually application is getting read, that you're evaluating it. But that doesn't happen in Congress, in part because it's so fragmented. So we can't see the application pool. We can only see who is hired, right? And even there are limitations then because Congress does not collect racial demographic data. Oftentimes when you're getting these numbers, it's because I have gone out to find the racial identity of these folks by looking at their photos online. So it's just like this really long process to sort of measure. But we can look at promotion rates, right? And what we do see is that women and people of color are having problems, reaching that higher rung, right? They can make it up to mid-level positions, but either they're exiting, and that could be because of um, their own, desire to do something else. It's a really tough job, it's low pay, or is it because of barriers, right? So I would hope that, I think this book is the opening salvo into more research on this matter, right? And there's so much that we still do not know.
No, and the points that you're making or the facts you're stating is one of the reasons why the first step that civil rights advocates, lawyers, policymakers will do is mandate data collection. This was a problem with racial profiling, particularly in the 90s, where it was a political debate that lacked any data. And the first thing that those who believed there was, in fact, anti-Black racial profiling that was risking not only the dignity, but also the liberty of African American communities, was why don't you track the race of the people who are stopped by the cops and arrested? Well, even just stopped and given a ticket, right? Just the profiling aspect. And once that data was available, then it confirmed what African American communities had been saying and the data they'd been collecting on their own, but that the government was rejecting. So I think that's an important point that listeners, when you find government officials or elites or people with power fighting against keeping track of racial demographics, that is a red flag. That can be interpreted, and most likely should be interpreted, as attempting to hide something. Because if the data shows that there, in fact, isn't racial disparity in, for example, applications or hiring or promotion or gender disparities or disparities based on disability, then that can resolve that debate, right? And we can put it to rest based on the facts rather than on political opinions. So I have another question here. So with regard to the current administration, I think we can't talk about your book without talking about the Trump administration is the second administration now, or in 2025. Open, explicit, blatant opposition to anything DEI related. So we're not even talking about affirmative action, which tended to be more remedial and trying to remedy the legacies of especially anti-Black racism, but other forms of bias like xenophobia, anti-Asian bias, etc. But DEI is a much more diluted and non-remedial approach to saying, let's at least have our workplaces, our schools, our C-suites, our Congress, especially let's say in the staffing area, but have it reflect the diversity of our society, not just along racial lines. It could be age, disability, I mean, some of it's mutable characteristics, some of it's immutable characteristics. Based on your research, give us what's your perspective? What's going on here? Why is Trump so anti-DEI? Why are his supporters so anti-DEI? Why are they alleging that DEI is anti-white racism when it actually includes white people in the programmatic initiatives?
So I want to focus on the subtitle of my book, right, which is an racial what is it, racism and resistance in the Congress and US Congress. And I think it's that last word, that second word, right? It's about resistance, right? I think to understand this moment, it is to understand the power that these folks have by virtue of being in the federal government. And I mean power in the most diverse way. It is power not necessarily to do what you want with laws, but to make sure that these laws are working as they are supposed to be, right, as intended. It is power in the sense that this is just also, these are good jobs. There's stability, there are good benefits, there's relatively good pay. This is the federal government. It is long been a refuge for Black workers, both professional and in the service position. And which was
And you're talking about the federal workplace in general, not just Congress.
yes, in
Okay.
general. This is something that has been a crucial support for the foundation of the Black middle class. So by eliminating this, you are trying to undo this progress, right? You are trying to undo decades of racial progress, weakening the middle class, but also, weakening resistance, right? Again, what I've shown throughout this, my book and this talk is that these staffers have a lot of power, and it's not like power to do, to go rogue and do whatever you want. I mean, I think that's actually the current administration, right? Right, who is not abiding by the law. But it is to make sure that these laws are working as intended, right? That they are just and that they are equitable. It also is to say that we didn't get to this political moment overnight, right? So the House Republicans, abolished their DEI office last spring, right? And it was now what we sort of recognize is that this was an omen of what was to come. And by the way, the Senate has never even had one, right? Democrats and Republicans have refused to do it, right? They don't want any oversight. And so I think in many ways, what we're seeing is the federal government, the White House, try and make the rest of the federal government kind of like Congress, right? Where it is a place that is relatively lawless, right? And these people can do whatever they want. And I think what we know what happens when that is the case, when there is not strong anti-discrimination protections in place, right? There is not only racism, there is sexism, there is a toxicity that takes place where people are easily abused and exploited, right? And so I think, it is a direct correlation to what Congress has tried to overcome, but ultimately fail to do, right? I think, Trump is marrying, in many ways, Congress, I would say.
All right, so we have one more final question. in one of your quotes from the women that you interviewed, she was discussing as a Black woman how she was thinking and conscientious of the Hispanic constituency, for example, in addition to the African American constituency. And that based on her experience, that those constituencies were not often heard from, or that for whatever reason, her boss, the elected official, did not have access to their perspectives. And she seemed to allude to the fact that perhaps there weren't organizations that were representing them, or that they weren't coming and doing the usual citizen lobbying. So what is the role of civil society, and how does that interact with the staffers? Because, if I were to play the contrarian, I would tell you, give you the colorblind response. Look, race doesn't matter. Maybe politics matters, maybe ideological leaning and commitment matters, but it really shouldn't matter. I'm role playing here, whether the staffer is a Black woman or a white woman or a white man or a Black man. And just talking about race is racist. And therefore, your entire book project is racist in that regard. And so I think what's interesting is how you bring forward the lived experiences and perspectives of people who are Black, in this case, in your book, that does affect, right, how they think, how they analyze, and whose perspectives and interests they're thinking about. So um, how does that interplay with the lack of civil society? In other words, is it that we need more diversity in Congress because those interns, those staffers, those directors, by virtue of their lived experiences as non-whites, or as not male, or as not heterosexual male, that they're bringing perspectives and experiences? Um, is that only it? Or what if we were to have civil society that was more robust? What if we were to have ways in which even the low income and the less educated and those who are generally more vulnerable to being invisible and voiceless in our society, that they were to have a voice with the elected officials? So I guess I'm just trying to unpack why race matters.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I would say at the onset, the chief the chief responsibility of Congress is to represent diverse interest, right? Full stop. That's why Congress exists. That's why we have the structure of Congress. That's why we have the Senate and House of Representatives. It is to represent diverse interests. Particularly, it's the only branch of our federal government that can do that effectively, right? That is its goal. That is its reason as being. That is why it is the first branch of government, the one that the Constitution talks about the most. When there's only one group in the room, Congress is failing at its job, right? It's not representing diverse interests, right? And so we need racial diversity, but we also need gender diversity. We need class diversity. I think in the absence of I'll say we need that, right? So I will also say that I think when I'm talking about racial and gender diversity, and the importance of particularly amongst the staff, it's also what I'm trying to say is that I guess Congress is frankly broken. It's not working as it's intended, right? And so staffers are a tool to make sure that Congress, again, is representing who it's supposed to do. And again, we know that oftentimes it's not, that we live in a political system dominated by money, right? We just didn't get to an oligarchy in 2025, but what political research has shown us is that, Congress has been captured by elite interests since the 1980s, right? So, in part, what I have found, at least amongst Black staffers, is that they are that person in the room who are saying, have you considered this, right? When there are all these other interests, moneyed interests that have louder voices, right? So it becomes a balance. I'll say one quote that's sticking out to me is a moment I was talking to a white Republican staffer, and woman staffer, and heterosexual, and she said, sometimes it's my job to be in the Republican caucus meetings to say, hey, this idea is sexist. Also, this is just a homophobic policy. We shouldn't do it, right? And so I think we need diversity on multiple levels, especially in the absence of, you know, um, you know, Congress not having you know, the attention span, the capacity to actually engage with anyone. Where I think civil society comes in importantly is one, of course, like direct lobbying, but I think part of this again is this fundamental failure of Congress, where I think it is this institution that is very insular. We don't know how it's supposed to work. And there's just a lack of accountability, right? If we think about this in terms of like even the demographics of the congressional workplace, we don't know who works there. We don't know who has power. Without having this data, it becomes hard to hold us accountable, right? So, I think my goal in my research is twofold. One is to make it a much more diverse workplace, but second is actually to make it a much better institution, right? I think there is this analogous between it being the first branch and the last plantation, right? It can't do its job when it's of the first branch when it's the last plantation, right? So how do we fundamentally refix Congress, right? Part of that has to be thinking about racial and gender and class equity as well.
Well put. We have a lot of work to do, to put it mildly, especially at this political moment. So thank you very much, Dr. Jones, for enlightening us with your research. And I hope that everyone who attended or listens to this recording will purchase your book, The Last Plantation, Racism and Resistance in the Halls of Congress. And if people want to learn more about the various work that the Center for Security, Race, and Rights does, please go to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu. Our next lecture will feature Paul Butler, and he will be talking about his groundbreaking book, Chokehold, and that will be on April 9th, 2025. Until then, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, and be sure to subscribe to the Race and Rights podcast, which I host. And every 2 weeks, we have another informative and provocative conversation with academics and experts that speak about matters that impact all of our lives, just like today's excellent lecture did. So with that, thank you very much, Dr. Jones, and thank you everyone who joined us, and we'll see you at the next lecture. Ma salama.